Section 61 of Reviews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Reviews by Oscar Wilde. Section 61. Literary and Other Notes. 3. Women's World, January 1888. Madame Ristori's Etudes et Souvenirs is one of the most delightful books on the stage that has appeared since Lady Martin's charming volume on the Shakespearean heroines. It is often said that actors leave nothing behind them but a barren name and a withered wreath, that they subsist simply upon the applause of the moment, that they are ultimately doomed to the oblivion of old play-bills, and that their art, in a word, dies with them, and shares their own mortality. Chippendale, the cabinet-maker, says the clever author of Obiter Dicta is more potent than Garrick the actor. The vivacity of the latter no longer charms, save in Boswell. The chairs of the former still render rest impossible in 100 homes. This view, however, seems to me to be exaggerated. It rests on the assumption that acting is simply a mimetic art, and takes no account of its imaginative and intellectual basis. It is quite true, of course, that the personality of the player passes away, and with it that pleasure-giving power by virtue of which the arts exist. Yet the artistic method of a great actor survives. It lives on in tradition, and becomes part of the science of a school. It has all the intellectual life of a principle. In England, at the present moment, the influence of Garrick on our actors is far stronger than that of Reynolds on our painters of portraits, and if we turn to France, it is easy to discern the tradition of Talma, but where is the tradition of David? Madame Ristori's memoirs, then, have not merely the charm that always attaches to the autobiography of a brilliant and beautiful woman, but have also a definite and distinct artistic value. Her analysis of the character of Lady Macbeth, for instance, is full of psychological interest, and shows us that the subtleties of Shakespearean criticism are not necessarily confined to those who have views on weak endings and rhyming tags, but may also be suggested by the art of acting itself. The author of Obiter Dicta seeks to deny to actors all critical insight and all literary appreciation. The actor, he tells us, is art's slave, not her child, and lives entirely outside literature, with its words for ever on his lips, and none of its truths engraven on his heart. But this seems to me to be a harsh and reckless generalisation. Indeed, so far from agreeing with it, I would be inclined to say that the mere artistic process of acting, the translation of literature back again into life, and the presentation of thought under the conditions of action, is in itself a critical method of a very high order, nor do I think that a study of the careers of our great English actors will really sustain the charge of want of literary appreciation. It may be true that actors pass too quickly away from the form, in order to get at the feeling that gives the form beauty and colour, and that, where the literary critic studies the language, the actor looks simply for the life. And yet, how well the great actors have appreciated that marvellous music of words which in Shakespeare, at any rate, is so vital an element of poetic power, if indeed it be not equally so in the case of all who have any claim to be regarded as true poets. "The sensual life of verse," says Keats, in a dramatic criticism published in the Champion, "springs warm from the lips of Kean, and to one learned in Shakespearean hieroglyphics, learned in the spiritual portion of those lines to which Kean adds a sensual grandeur. His tongue must seem to have robbed the Hybla bees and left them honeyless." This particular feeling of which Keats speaks is familiar to all who have heard Salvini, Sarah Bernhardt, Ristori, or any of the great artists of our day, and it is a feeling that one cannot, I think, gain merely by reading the passage to oneself. For my own part, I must confess that it was not until I heard Sarah Bernhardt in Phèdre that I absolutely realised the sweetness of the music of Racine. As for Mr. Birrell's statement that actors have the words of literature for ever on their lips, but none of its truths engraved on their hearts, all that one can say is that, if it be true, it is a defect which actors share with the majority of literary critics. The account Madame Ristori gives of her own struggles, voyages and adventures is very pleasant reading indeed. The child of poor actors, she made her first appearance when she was 3 months old, being brought on in a hamper as a New Year's gift to a selfish old gentleman who would not forgive his daughter for having married for love. As, however, she began to cry long before the hamper was opened, the comedy became a farce, to the immense amusement of the public. She next appeared in a mediaeval melodrama, being then 3 years of age, and was so terrified at the machinations of the villain that she ran away at the most critical moment. However, her stage fright seems to have disappeared, and we find her playing Silvio Pellico's Francesco da Rimini at 15, and at 18 making her debut as Marie Stuart. At this time the naturalism of the French method was gradually displacing the artificial elocution and academic poses of the Italian school of acting. Madame Ristori seems to have tried to combine simplicity with style, and the passion of nature with the self-restraint of the artist.
J'ai voulu fondre les deux manières, she tells us, car je sentais que toute chose étant susceptible de progrès, l'art dramatique aussi était appelé à subir des transformations.
The natural development, however, of the Italian drama was almost arrested by the ridiculous censorship of plays then existing in each town under Austrian or Papal rule. The slightest allusion to the sentiment of nationality or the spirit of freedom was prohibited. Even the word patria was regarded as treasonable, and Madame Ristori tells us an amusing story of the indignation of a censor who was asked to license a play, in which a dumb man returns home after an absence of many years, and on his entrance upon the stage makes gestures expressive of his joy in seeing his native land once more. Gestures of this kind, said the censor, are obviously of a very revolutionary tendency, and cannot possibly be allowed. The only gestures that I could think of permitting would be gestures expressive of a dumb man's delight in scenery generally. The stage directions were accordingly altered, and the word landscape substituted for native land. Another censor was extremely severe on an unfortunate poet who had used the expression the beautiful Italian sky, and explained to him that the beautiful Lombardo Venetian sky was the proper official expression to use. Poor Gregory in Romeo and Juliet had to be rechristened, because Gregory is a name dear to the popes, and the "Here I have a pilot's thumb," wrecked as homeward he did come, of the first which, in Macbeth, was ruthlessly struck out as containing an obvious allusion to the steersman of St. Peter's bark. Finally, bored and bothered by the political and theological Dogberries of the day, with their inane prejudices, their solemn stupidity, and their entire ignorance of the conditions necessary for the growth of sane and healthy art, Madame Ristori made up her mind to leave the stage. She, however, was extremely anxious to appear once before a Parisian audience, Paris being at the time the centre of dramatic activity, and after some consideration left Italy for France in the year 1855. There she seems to have been a great success, particularly in the part of Myra. Classical without being cold, artistic without being academic, she brought to the interpretation of the character of Alfieri's great heroine the colour element of passion, the form element of style. Jules Janine was loud in his praises. The Emperor begged Ristori to join the troupe of the Comédie Française, and Rachel, with the strange narrow jealousy of her nature, trembled for her laurels. Myra was followed by Marie Stuart, and Marie Stuart by Medea. In the later part Madame Ristori excited and greatest enthusiasm. Ari Schiffer designed her costumes for her, and the Niobe that stands in the Uffizi Gallery at Florence suggested to Madame Ristori her famous pose in the scene with the children. She would not consent, however, to remain in France, and we find her subsequently playing in almost every country in the world from Egypt to Mexico, from Denmark to Honolulu. Her representations of classical plays seem to have been always immensely admired. When she played at Athens, the king offered to arrange for a performance in the beautiful old theatre of Dionysus, and during her tour in Portugal she produced Medea before the University of Coimbra. Her description of the latter engagement is extremely interesting. On her arrival at the University, she was received by the entire body of the undergraduates, who still wear a costume almost medieval in character. Some of them came on the stage in the course of the play as the handmaidens of Creusa, hiding their black beards beneath heavy veils, and as soon as they had finished their parts, they took their places gravely among the audience, to Madame Ristori's horror, still in their Greek dress, but with their veils thrown back, and smoking long cigars.
Ce n'est pas la première fois, she says, que j'ai dû empêcher, par un effort de volonté, la tragédie de se terminer en farce.
Very interesting also is her account of the production of Montali's Camma, and she tells an amusing story of the arrest of the author by the French police, on the charge of murder, in consequence of a telegram she sent to him in which the words body of the victim occurred. Indeed, the whole book is full of cleverly written stories, and admirable criticisms on dramatic art. I have quoted from the French version, which happens to be the one that lies before me, but whether in French or Italian, the book is one of the most fascinating autobiographies that has appeared for some time, even in an age like ours, when literary egotism has been brought to such an exquisite pitch of perfection. The New Purgatory and Other Poems, by Miss E.R. Chapman, is, in some respects, a very remarkable little volume. It used to be said that women were too poetical by nature to make great poets, too receptive to be really creative, too well satisfied with mere feeling to search after the marble splendour of form. But we must not judge of women's poetic power by her achievements in days when education was denied to her. For where there is no faculty of expression, no art is possible. Mrs. Browning, the first great English poetess, was also an admirable scholar, though she may not have put the accents on her Greek, and even in those poems that seem most remote from classical life, such as Aurelie, for instance, it is not difficult to trace the fine literary influence of a classical training. Since Mrs. Browning's time, education has become, not the privilege of a few women, but the inalienable inheritance of all. And as a natural consequence of the increased faculty of expression thereby gained, the women poets of our day hold a very high literary position. Curiously enough, their poetry is, as a rule, more distinguished for strength than for beauty. They seem to love to grapple with the big intellectual problems of modern life. Science, philosophy, and metaphysics form a large portion of their ordinary subject matter. They leave the triviality of triolets to men, and try to read the writing on the wall, and to solve the last secret of the Sphinx. Hence Robert Browning, not Keats, is their idol. Sordello moves them more than the ode on a Grecian urn, and all Lord Tennyson's magic and music seems to them as nothing compared with the psychological subtleties of The Ring and the Book, or the pregnant question stirred in the dialogue between Blougram and Gigadibs. Indeed, I remember hearing a charming young Girtonian, forgetting for a moment the exquisite lyrics in Pippa Passes, and the superb blank verse of Men and Women, state quite seriously that the reason she admired the author of Red Cotton Nightcap Country was that he had headed a reaction against beauty in poetry. Miss Chapman is probably one of Mr. Browning's disciples. She does not imitate him, but it is easy to discern his influence on her verse, and she has caught something of his fine, strange faith. Take, for instance, her poem, A Strong-Minded Woman. See her, oh yes, come this way, hush, this way, here she is lying, sweet, with the smile her face wore yesterday, as she lay dying. Calm, the mind fever gone, and, praise God, gone, all the heart hunger. Looking the merest girl at 41, you guessed her younger. Well, she'd the flower bloom that children have, was lithe and pliant, with eyes as innocent blue as they were brave, resolved, defiant. Yourself, you worship art. Well, at that shrine she too bowed lowly, drank thirstily of beauty as of wine, proclaimed it holy. But could you follow her when, in a breath, she knelt to science, vowing to truth true service to the death, and heart reliance? Nay, then for you she underwent eclipse, appeared as alien, as once, before he prayed, those ivory lips seemed Pygmalion. Here, from your heaven, my dear, my lost delight, you, who were woman, to your heart's heart, and not more pure, more white, than warmly human, how shall I answer, how express, reveal, your true life story? How utter, if they cannot guess, not feel, your crowning glory? This way, attend my words, the rich we know do into heaven enter but hardly, to the poor, the low, God's kingdom's given. Well, there's another heaven, a heaven on earth, that's love fruition, whereto a certain lack, a certain dearth, gains best admission. Here too, she was too rich. Ah, God, if less love had been lent her into the realm of human happiness, these looked not enter. Well, here we have, if not quite an echo, at least a reminiscence of the metre of the grammarian's funeral, and the peculiar blending together of lyrical and dramatic forms seems essentially characteristic of Mr. Browning's method. Yet there is a distinct personal note running all through the poem, and true originality is to be found rather in the use made of a model than in the rejection of all models and masters.
Dans l'art, comme dans la nature, on est toujours fils de quelqu'un.
And we should not quarrel with the reed if it whispers to us the music of the lyre. A little child once asked me if it was the nightingale who taught the linnets how to sing. Miss Chapman's other poems contain a great deal that is interesting. The most ambitious is the New Purgatory, to which the book owes its title. It is a vision of a strange garden in which, cleansed and purified of all stain and shame, walked Judas of Cherioth, Nero the Lord of Rome, Jezebel the wife of Ahab, and others, around whose names cling terrible memories of horror, or who awful splendours of sin. The conception is fine, but the treatment is hardly adequate. There are, however, some good strong lines in it, and, indeed, almost all of Miss Chapman's poems are worth reading, if not for their absolute beauty, at least for their intellectual intention. Nothing is more interesting than to watch the change and development of the art of novel writing in this 19th century, this so-called 19th century, as an impassioned young orator once termed it, after a contemptuous diatribe against the evils of modern civilization. In France they have had one great genius, Balzac, who invented the modern method of looking at life, and one great artist, Flaubert, who is the impeccable master of style, and to the influence of these two men we may trace almost all contemporary French fiction. But in England we have had no schools worth speaking of. The fiery torch lit by the Brontes has not been passed on to other hands. Dickens has influenced only journalism. Thackeray's delightful superficial philosophy, superb narrative power, and clever social satire have found no echoes, nor has Trollope left any direct successors behind him, a fact which is not much to be regretted, however, as admirable though Trollope undoubtedly is for rainy afternoons and tedious railway journeys. From the point of view of literature, he is merely the perpetual curate of Puddlington Parva. As for George Meredith, who could hope to reproduce him? His style is chaos, illumined by brilliant flashes of lightning. As a writer he has mastered everything except language. As a novelist he can do everything, except tell a story. As an artist he is everything, except articulate. Too strange to be popular, too individual to have imitators, the author of Richard Feverel stands absolutely alone. It is easy to disarm criticism, but he has disarmed the disciple. He gives us his philosophy through the medium of wit, and is never so pathetic as when he is humorous. To turn truth into a paradox is not difficult, but George Meredith makes all his paradoxes truths, and no Theseus can thread his labyrinth, no Oedipus solve his secret. However, it is only fair to acknowledge that there are some signs of a school springing up amongst us. This school is not native, nor does it seek to reproduce any English master. It may be described as the result of the realism of Paris filtered through the refining influence of Boston. Analysis, not action, is its aim. It has more psychology than passion, and it plays very cleverly upon one string, and this is the commonplace. As a reaction against this school, it is pleasant to come across a novel like Lady Augusta Noel's Hitherseer Mere. If this story has any definite defect, it comes from its delicacy and lightness of treatment. An industrious Bostonian would have made half a dozen novels out of it, and have had enough left for a serial. Lady Augusta Noel is content to vivify her characters, and does not care about vivisection. She suggests rather than explains, and she does not seek to make life too obviously rational. Romance, picturesqueness, charm, these are the qualities of her book. As for its plot, it has so many plots that it is difficult to describe them. We have the story of Rona Somerville, the daughter of a great popular preacher. She tries to write her father's life, and, on looking over his papers and early diaries, finds struggle where she expected calm, and doubt where she looked for faith, and is afraid to keep back the truth, and yet dares not publish it. Rona is quite charming. She is like a little flower that takes itself very seriously, and she shows us how thoroughly nice and natural a narrow-minded girl may be. Then we have the two brothers, John and Adrian Mowbray. John is the hard-working, vigorous clergyman, who is impatient of all theories, brings his faith to the test of action, not of intellect, lives what he believes, and has no sympathy for those who waver or question. A thoroughly admirable, practical, and extremely irritating man. Adrian is the fascinating dilettante, the philosophic doubter, a sort of romantic rationalist with a taste of art. Of course, Rona marries the brother who needs conversion, and their gradual influence on each other is indicated by a few subtle touches. Then we have the curious story of Olga, Adrian Mowbray's first love. She is a wonderful and mystical girl, like a little maiden out of the sagas, with the blue eyes and the fair hair of the north. An old Norwegian nurse is always at her side, a sort of Lapland witch who teaches her how to see visions and to interpret dreams. Adrian mocks at this superstition, as he calls it, but as a consequence of disregarding it, Olga's only brother is drowned skating, and she never speaks to Adrian again. The whole story is told in the most suggestive way, the mere delicacy of the touch making what is strange seem real. The most delightful character in the whole book, however, is a girl called Hilary Marston, and hers also is the most tragic tale of all. Hilary is like a little woodland fawn, half Greek and half gypsy. She knows the note of every bird, and the haunt of every animal. She is terribly out of place in a drawing-room, but is on intimate terms with every young poacher in the district. Squirrels come and sit on her shoulder, which is pretty, and she carries ferrets in her pockets, which is dreadful. She never reads a book, and has not got a single accomplishment, but she is fascinating and fearless, and wiser, in her own way, than any pedant or bookworm. This poor little English dryad falls passionately in love with a great blind helpless hero, who regards her as a sort of pleasant tomboy, and her death is most touching and pathetic. Lady Augusta Noel has a charming and winning style. Her descriptions of nature are quite admirable, and her book is one of the most pleasantly written novels that has appeared this winter. Miss Alice Corcoran's Marjorie Merton's Girlhood has the same lightness of touch and grace of treatment. Though ostensibly meant for young people, it is a story that all can read with pleasure, for it is true without being harsh, and beautiful without being affected, and its rejection of the stronger and more violent passions of life is artistic rather than ascetic. In a word, it is a little piece of true literature, as dainty as it is delicate, and as sweet as it is simple. Marjorie Merton is brought up in Paris by an old maiden aunt, who has an elaborate theory of education, and strict ideas about discipline. Her system is an excellent one, being founded on the science of Darwin and the wisdom of Solomon, but it comes to terrible grief when put into practice, and finally she has to procure a governess, Madame Reville, the widow of a great and unappreciated French painter. From her Marjorie gets her first feeling for art, and the chief interest of the book centres round a competition for an art scholarship, in which Marjorie and the other girls of the convent school enter. Marjorie selects Joan of Arc as her subject, and rather to the horror of the good nuns, who think that the saint should have her golden aureole, and be as gorgeous as ecclesiastical as bright paints and bad drawing can make her. The picture represents a common peasant girl standing in an old orchard, and listening in ignorant terror to the strange voices whispering in her ear. The scene in which she shows her sketch for the first time to the art master and the mother superior is very cleverly rendered indeed, and shows considerable dramatic power. Of course, a good deal of opposition takes place, but ultimately Marjorie has her own way, and, in spite of a wicked plot set on foot by a jealous competitor, who persuades the mother superior that the picture is not Marjorie's own work, she succeeds in winning the prize. The whole account of the gradual development of the conception in the girl's mind, and the various attempts she makes to give her dream its perfect form, is extremely interesting, and, indeed, the book deserves a place among what Sir George Trevelyan has happily termed the art of literature of our day. Mr. Ruskin in prose and Mr. Browning in poetry were the first who drew for us the workings of the artist's soul, the first who led us from the painting or statue to the hand that fashioned it, and the brain that gave it life. They seem to have made art more expressive for us, to have shown us a passionate humanity lying behind line and colour. Theirs was the seed of this new literature, and theirs too is its flower. But it is pleasant to note their influence on Miss Cochrane's little story, in which the creation of a picture forms the dominant motive. Mrs. Pfeiffer's Woman and Work is a collection of most interesting essays on the relation to health and physical development of the higher education of girls, and the intellectual or more systematized effort of women. Mrs. Pfeiffer, who writes a most admirable prose style, deals in succession with the sentimental difficulty, with the economic problem, and with the arguments of physiologists. She boldly grapples with Professor Romans, whose recent article in the 19th Century on the leading characters which mentally differentiate men and women attracted so much attention, and produces some very valuable statistics from America, where the influence of education on health has been most carefully studied. Her book is a most important contribution to the discussion of one of the great social problems of our day. The extended activity of women is now an accomplished fact. Its results are on their trial, and Mrs. Pfeiffer's excellent essays sum up the situation very completely, and show the rational and scientific basis of the movement more clearly and more logically than any other treatise I have as yet seen. It is interesting to note that many of the most advanced modern ideas on the subject of the education of women are anticipated by Defoe in his wonderful essay upon projects, where he proposes that a college for women should be erected in every county in England, and 10 colleges of the kind in London. "I have often thought of it," he says, "as one of the most barbarous customs in the world that we deny the advantages of learning to women. Their youth is spent to teach them to stitch and sew, or make baubles. They are taught to read, indeed, and perhaps to write their names or so, and that is the height of a woman's education. And I would but ask any who slight the sex for their understanding, what is a man, a gentleman, I mean, good for that is taught no more? What has the woman done to forfeit the privilege of being taught? Shall we upbraid women with folly, when it is only the error of this inhuman custom that hindered them being made wiser?" Defoe then proceeds to elaborate his scheme for the foundation of women's colleges, and enters into minute details about the architecture, the general curriculum, and the discipline. His suggestion that the penalty of death should be inflicted on any man who ventured to make a proposal of marriage to any of the girl students during term time possibly suggested the plot of Lord Tennyson's Princess, so its harshness may be excused, and in all other respects his ideas are admirable. I am glad to see that this curious little volume forms one of the National Library series. It is anticipations of many of our most modern inventions. It shows how thoroughly practical all dreamers are. I am sorry to see that Mrs. Fawcett deprecates the engagement of ladies of education as dressmakers and milliners, and speaks of it as being detrimental to those who have fewer educational advantages. I myself would like to see dressmaking regarded not merely as a learned profession, but as a fine art. To construct a costume that will be at once rational and beautiful requires an accurate knowledge of the principles of proportion, a thorough acquaintance with the laws of health, a subtle sense of colour, and a quick appreciation of the proper use of materials, and the proper qualities of pattern and design. The health of a nation depends very largely on its mode of dress. The artistic feeling of a nation should find expression in its costume quite as much as in its architecture, and just as the upholstering tradesman has had to give place to the decorative artist, so the ordinary milliner, with her lack of taste and lack of knowledge, her foolish fashions and her feeble inventions, will have to make way for the scientific and artistic dress designer. Indeed, so far from it being wise to discourage women of education from taking up the profession of dressmakers, it is exactly women of education who are needed, and I am glad to see in the new Technical College for Women at Bedford, millinery and dressmaking are to be taught as part of the ordinary curriculum. There has also been started in London a society of lady dressmakers for the purpose of teaching educated girls and women, and the Scientific Dress Association is, I hear, doing very good work in the same direction. I have received some very beautiful specimens of Christmas books from Messrs. Griffith and Farren, Treasures of Art and Song, edited by Robert Ellis Mack. Is a real edition de luxe of pretty poems and pretty pictures, and through the year is a wonderfully artistic calendar. Messrs. Hildesheimer and Faulkner have also sent me Rhymes and Roses, illustrated by Ernest Wilson and Sinclair Simmons, Cape Town Dicky, a child's book, with some very lovely pictures by Miss Alice Havis, a wonderful edition of The Deserted Village, illustrated by Mr. Charles Gregory and Mr. Hines, and some really charming Christmas cards, those by Miss Alice Havers, Miss Edwards, and Miss Dearly being especially good. The most perfect and the most poisonous of all modern French poets once remarked that a man can live for 3 days without bread, but that no one can live for 3 days without poetry. This, however, can hardly be said to be a popular view, or one that commends itself to that curiously uncommon quality which is called common sense. I fancy that most people, if they do not actually prefer a salmi to a sonnet, certainly like their culture to repose on a basis of good cookery, and as there is something to be said for this attitude, I am glad to see that several ladies are interesting themselves in cookery classes. Mrs. Marshall's brilliant lectures are, of course, well known, and besides her there is Madame Fawcett, who holds weekly classes in Kensington. Madame Fawcett is the author of an admirable little book, entitled Economical French Cookery for Ladies, and I am glad to hear that her lectures are so successful. I was talking the other day to a lady who works a great deal at the East End of London, and she told me that no small part of the permanent misery of the poor is due to their entire ignorance of the cleanliness and economy necessary for good cooking. The Popular Ballad Concert Society has been reorganised under the names of the Popular Musical Union. Its object will be to train the working classes thoroughly in the enjoyment and performance of music, and to provide the inhabitants of the crowded districts of the East End with concerts and oratories, to be performed as far as possibly by trained members of the working classes, and though money is urgently required, it is proposed to make the society to a certain degree self-supporting by giving something in the form of high-class concerts in return for the subscriptions and donations. The whole scheme is an excellent one, and I hope that the readers of the Women's World will give it their valuable support. Mrs. Ernest Hart is the secretary, and the treasurer is Reverend S. Barnett. 1. Etudes et Souvenirs by Madame Ristori, Paul Ollendorff. 2. The New Purgatory and Other Poems by Elizabeth Rachel Chapman, Fisher Unwin. 3. Hither Mere by Lady Augusta Noel, author of Wandering Willie, From Generation to Generation, etc. Macmillan and Co. 4. Marjorie Merton's Girlhood by Alice Corcoran, Blackie and Son. 5. Women and Work by Emily Pfeiffer, Trubner and Co. 6. Treasures of Art and Song, edited by Robert Ellis Mack, Griffith and Farren. 7. Rhyme and Roses, illustrated by Ernest Wilson and Sinclair Simmons, Cape Town Dicky, illustrated by Alice Havers. The Deserted Pillage, illustrated by Charles Gregory and John Hines, Hildesheimer and Faulkner. End of section 61.